Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you very much for joining us today. We're delighted with the turnout, actually, of this webinar, one of the biggest we've had for an e-discovery webinar. My name is John Tinsley, CEO and co-founder of Iconic, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the growing role of translation technology for e-discovery, compliance, big data, digital forensics, and more. Just to let you know, we are recording this webinar and we'll be making the recording available to you afterwards so that you can share it with your colleagues if needs be. And we'll also be making the slides themselves available on SlideShare. So let's get straight into it and talk about translation. The growing aspect, I guess, comes from two sources. In the first instance, it's the people that we're talking to on a daily basis around the world, be that law firms, service providers, who are seeing an increase in the number of cases where they have to handle foreign language information. Secondly, we're seeing this from our own experience based on the increase in inquiries that we've seen over the last 18 months for support in this particular area. I guess before 2017, Iconic wasn't directly very active in this field, which is maybe why you haven't heard of us before if you're coming from the legal space, but rather we were working in different verticals, different industries, which I'll talk about as well. But we saw the queries constantly coming in to provide translation software services in the area of e-discovery. And so we decided to be a little bit more proactive about providing a turnkey offering in this space. And I guess this demand is also reflected in a report, in some statistics in a report from Gartner around a year ago that stated that around 80% of all litigation will have some multilingual component by 2020. And I guess that's not hard to believe, given that to some extent, borders are fluid when it comes to business and globalization. Here in Dublin, where we are based, we have giant corporations like Google and Microsoft with offices in scores of countries around the world. They've got a massive workforce of multinational employees. So there is a lot of multilingual information flying around. And this growth of this multilingual content is inevitable, as we can see from this graph. So we attended a conference last week in Dublin on e-discovery and information governance. And the keynote speaker, Craig Ball, gave a really interesting presentation speaking about the growth of electronically stored information. So we can see that here we are in 2017 with around 15 zettabytes of data in the world, and that's been kind of growing gradually over the last 10 years, but it's now growing at a 40% compound annual rate, to the point where by 2020 you'll see that that's going to have risen to 45 zettabytes, which is 45 billion terabytes, to give you a sense of the scale that we're talking about there. So if you put this growth in data together with globalization and the increase in multilingual information, language questions are going to be inevitable in e-discovery, which is where I guess the likes of Iconic come in. So by way of introduction to our company, who is Iconic Translation Machines, or what are we? So essentially we're a translation and language technology software and solutions provider. And that means essentially at our core, we develop machine translation technology for various industries and use cases, and also supporting language technology around that. I've mentioned already that we're headquartered in Dublin, Ireland, but we operate globally around the world with clients across 4 continents. And then who are the types of companies that actually use this technology? This is where we have quite a wide variety. Aside from law firms and e-discovery providers, we have information providers, government organizations, and enterprises. Here's a quick snapshot of some of our users and partners. And these guys all use machine translation in various different ways. And I will come back to that a little bit later in the context of some use cases. But what I want to try and do now is give you the briefest of overviews of what machine translation actually is. I'm saying machine translation in 60 seconds here because this is something I could talk about for 60 minutes or 60 hours. So I want to try and discipline myself here to restrict it to 60 seconds. And to help myself out in doing this, I'm going to put this clock on the screen here to put some pressure on myself. So the history of machine translation as a technology, it started in the late 40s, funded by the US government with an interest in translating Russian documents to English. And it's kind of grown since there with funding from the US, funding from the European Commission. And it essentially works by learning from previous examples of translations. So you give the software lots of examples of words translated between different languages, and then when it has new words and phrases to translate, it draws on its memory to produce a new translation. It's a particularly hard technology because, as I guess you're aware, language is quite alive. There is no necessarily one correct way to translate something, and there are new words being created all the time, which is why some languages are harder for machine translation than others. And this is quite a relevant point, again, that I'll talk about a little bit later on, but it's not a case of that we have a one-size-fits-all technology here. And the state of the art in this area is actually we've had a paradigm shift over the last 12 to 18 months, whereby it's all now not to kind of jump on the bandwagon, but it is actually all based around artificial intelligence and machine learning. And the state of the art is what we call neural machine translation. And again, I'll touch a little bit about this later on, but I've already well exceeded my 60 seconds, so I've already failed my first self-imposed task here. And just to give you a quick idea of how we at Iconic explicitly approach machine translation. So we have what we call our ensemble architecture. So we're not really dogmatic in terms of which technology we use. We're technology agnostic. So there are various different types of machine translation that we can use for different content types for different languages. So to give you an example, we have the ability to develop statistical machine translation, neural machine translation, as I mentioned. We can combine hybrid systems that include both different types of outputs. We can incorporate terminology from clients for particular cases, and then have different processes for different languages, and again, as I said, different content types. And this is what we really find ultimately delivers the best translation quality, because, as I said, there's no real one-size-fits-all technology here. It's about choosing the most appropriate technology workflow for the given task at hand. And I think that not only applies for translation, but for many tasks that use technology. Okay, so let's talk about translation and e-discovery and when the need actually arises for translation. So we see that there are broadly two times when translation needs arise. The first is the incidental requirement for translation. So they are things that come up from time to time. We can't really predict when they're going to come up. Generally, when they come up, there's not a lot of it. There's a low volume of content, but it can be in a mix of different languages. Again, we can't predict that. And what this tends to be is single documents that came up from maybe from a partner or a client, emails, threads with a few different languages in there, or various snippets of text. So that's one area where professionals in this space require translation services. The second is more driven by projects or larger cases. And so the characteristics of these is that there are more known quantities. So like I said, it could be based on a particular litigation case or a merger acquisition. So we know a lot about what's going on in there. So again, this could be, rather than being any particular language, we know it's going to be maybe only one or two languages. For example, if we're working with an Italian firm on an acquisition, obviously, I guess we know there's going to be a proportion of documents in Italian. But typically speaking, then, there are much larger volumes of files in question here, particularly for e-discovery itself and document review. There can be terabytes of data, and then again, across all different formats. So emails tend to be the most prevalent, but we're going to have PDFs, PowerPoints, and Excel spreadsheets and things like that. So there's quite a variety of content types there, even though we might be restricted to only one or two different languages. And so when these translation needs arise, what are your options? So let's use an anecdotal case here just to frame our answer. So a case comes into the firm, there are a large volume of documents, and around 300 of them are emails that are written in Italian. And the goal here is to identify those documents that are relevant or privileged to carry on with the case. So the first option is the scary one that, from talking to a lot of people, is what actually happens quite a lot, and that's to do nothing. We're going to put those 300 emails at the bottom of the pile. Hopefully we find something hot in the larger set of documents, and maybe we don't even need to come around to those Italian documents. So it's a scary thought that this actually happens, but it seems to be quite common, especially for smaller volumes of documents where we can maybe work around them. The second option, which is maybe the most the ideal one for people, is to look internally. Is there anyone in the firm who can help with either the review itself or with a translation of the document? So does anyone in our firm speak Italian? A paralegal, an intern, another partner? Do we have colleagues in a partner firm who could maybe help us out? So that's quite a common thing to do, again, for when we're dealing with a smaller number of documents here. Probably the most effective approach that we see is looking externally. So saying, okay, we have Italian emails, let's contract Italian reviewers to review these for us and flag those documents that are relevant. And then obviously the final option is translation. So we can translate those documents into English and then carry out the review as we would anyway. So with these options, there are various pros and cons. I'm not even going to look at the pros and cons of doing nothing. That's probably quite apparent at this point. So let's look at the other three options. So the first one is looking internally. So like I said, this is maybe the handiest approach. So its pros are there that it's quick. If there's someone in the firm, they can do it fairly quickly. And it's a pretty effective approach as well in terms of getting the job done, the goal of being able to determine relevant or privileged documents. The problem with this approach is that it doesn't scale. So maybe it works if we have 300 emails, but what if we have 30,000 emails? It's not going to be practical to take this approach. The availability is also not always guaranteed. So what if that person who speaks Italian in the firm is busy, is off that day, has left the firm since you last spoke to them? So we can't guarantee that this is a service that we will actually have to hand. And then also there's quite low coverage. So if you consider the number of languages we might potentially have documents in, we might have people that speak some languages in the office. We might have someone who speaks Italian, someone who speaks German, someone who speaks French. But again, we can't necessarily guarantee coverage across all the potential languages that come up. So if we look at the next option, to look externally and contract reviewers in, this is probably the most effective approach because you're getting legal professionals native in that language to carry out the review as they would normally. So nothing gets lost in translation, and the review is done by people doing this in their native language. The problem here is that this is expensive. So contract reviewers tend to carry a premium over native language English-speaking reviewers or internal reviewers. It's also a slow process because you have to procure them in the first instance before you actually get the review done. And then as the firm who owns the case, QA is a challenge because I guess you have to entrust that responsibility on top of the contract reviewers as well. And so you kind of lose a little bit of control in that regard. The final option then is translation. And again, this is a pretty effective approach because we get the documents translated and then we can carry out the review in the native language. The problems here are that it's particularly slow. It's because it's actually a three-step process. As with contract reviewers, we still have to procure the translation provider. Then the documents have to be translated, which can take some time depending on how many documents there are. And after that, we still have to do the review. So this is the slowest process. And it's also expensive because translation is charged by the word. And if we're dealing with extremely large volumes of content, there could be a lot of words. And so costs could go up quite quickly. And I say here that it doesn't scale. That's not necessarily true. It does scale if we simply have to have the translations by a certain time. We can just throw manpower at it and have hundreds of people carrying out the translations, but the costs will rise exponentially with that. So in essence, it doesn't really scale in any sort of practicable way. So just to highlight the middle option here, which is by far the most effective approach, I think it's probably also the most expensive approach. So given that it's the most effective but most expensive process, the question arises, is it strictly necessary? So if we look here at the kind of typical distribution of document review costs in US firms across the various options, we see that the contracting of foreign-speaking attorneys is 10% expensive than the next most expensive approach, which is contracting English-speaking attorneys. So given this, the question does arise, do we really have to do this, or do we have other options? Which is why now I want to focus on translation, which seems like, a potentially quite effective alternative option to the most expensive approach. And so if we look at the cons here again, I do want to highlight that here we are applying the human translation or the manual translation. But of course, given the nature of this presentation, there are other options than that. So before we jump into it, let's move the goalposts and assume that we are now dealing with 30,000 emails in Italian, and we have to look at our various options considering the budgets, etc. when it comes to translation. So with translation itself, there are actually three distinct options that you have. The first is what we've already talked about here, is professional human translation. The second option is free online machine translation that I presume most of you or all of you are familiar with. But the third option that you might be less familiar with is professional machine translation, and I'll explain the relative pros and cons of these approaches. So firstly, with human translation, we've already talked about the pros and cons here. This is going to certainly give you the best quality translation, but it's slow and expensive, and it doesn't necessarily scale. So let's look at the online machine translation option. Firstly, it is quick. I guess that's the assumption with the fact that we're using technology. It's going to be faster than the manual approaches, and it's also cheap and in many cases free. So that's excuse me, that's quite the pro, but the cons are numerous in this case. I guess the first biggest issue with these online tools is security or data confidentiality. What actually happens with the data when it goes up to these services? In many cases, we don't know exactly what's going to happen, but if you look at the data retention policies or the terms and conditions of many of the online providers, the data retention policy is that data is retained and they have the right to do with it as they please. That's just not going to fly in most legal cases. Secondly, there's an issue around quality, I guess, which goes with all machine translation, but again, for a general purpose online tool, the question around quality might be more stark. And then there are just simply limitations from a practical perspective about how online tools can be integrated into a workflow process to make it more efficient, and what file formats it can handle and how well it actually handles these. So there are quite a few cons there. So what I want to focus on is the professional machine translation approach. So looking at the pros here, again, it's quick, as it's obviously taken for granted with machine translation. It's also quite a cost-effective approach, so it's not free. It might not be super cheap, but it's certainly much more cost-effective than the other end of the scale, which would be the certified human translation. It's also generally a secure solution. I mean, I guess when I say it is secure, I would be specifically referring to our particular technology, which I'll go into a little bit more detail. But generally speaking, professional machine translation solutions will have a lot of the bases covered when it comes to kind of data security policies. And then typically these approaches are going to be more flexible than online tools in terms of how they can be used and integrated. And again, with these particular points, I'm going to touch on them very shortly as well. The question still remains here around quality, but this brings up the counter as to what level of quality is required. And we might argue that in many cases, the professional human translation here is overkill given the task at hand. Do we actually need a professional human translation in order to be able to determine whether a document is relevant or not? we would argue that we do not need that level of translation. And so I have a quote that I really like here from one of our partners, Owen Kenny here in Dublin, who's a senior discovery manager at A&L Goodbody. And he described the document review process as not an exercise in perfection. It's an exercise in establishing a legally defensible position, and that it is more than sufficient to be able to do that with the machine translation of a document with some analytics returned on it, and presenting to the court both of those documents, so that the basis on which you have established a particular position, and that in the vast majority of cases, machine translations are more than sufficient to be able to establish this position. So with that being said, there are still a lot of misconceptions out there around machine translation that I want to try to kind of respond to, I guess, and maybe do some myth busting in some of those cases. The most common of these is that it's rubbish, that the translation quality is no good. And that's simply not the case. Again, like I said, quality or performance needs to be defined based on how usable the translation is for a particular task. In the case of e-discovery, the task is being able to determine whether a document is relevant or not. And what we find from our experience is that in 90% of the cases, machine translations are good enough to be able to do this. Now, that is not to say that you're guaranteed 90% in all cases. Of course, 90% implies that in 10% of the cases, the translation won't be good enough. But also, we will see a little bit of a fluctuation in this across languages, because I mentioned earlier on that some languages are easier for machine translation than others, and obviously some languages are harder. So for just to give you an idea of what we do internally, we kind of informally categorize languages into 4 categories in terms of how suitable they are for machine translation, where we have languages like French, Spanish, and Portuguese, so the Romance languages, on the easier end of the scale. Things get a little bit more difficult as we go into German, Chinese, and Japanese. Things get even more difficult with languages as complexity increases, with the likes of Korean, Turkish. And then there is another end of the scale where we have languages like Finnish and Hungarian, which in the vast majority of cases don't lend themselves very well to machine translation. I was at a conference, a European Patent Office conference last week in Bulgaria, and I think I spoke to at least half a dozen Finnish people, and it always kind of breaks my heart to have to break the news to them that despite advances in the technology, that their language is still on the nearly impossible end of the scale. But how this kind of applies to the 90%, it might be the case that if we're dealing with languages like Spanish or French or Portuguese, that number is actually going to be much higher. It's going to be up around the 98% range. Whereas if we're looking at a lot of Korean documents, maybe it's going to be a little bit, more in the 80 to 90 realm. So, but I think this just goes to show that, clearly we're seeing that machine translation is more than fit for purpose for the task of document review and determining relevance to a particular task. I've touched on this already, but another misconception about machine translation is that it's not secure. And again, the counter to this is that it is secure in most cases. If we are talking about the free online machine translation tools, as I've described, that's not secure because we don't know what the data retention policies are, or we do know what they are, but we don't know ultimately what happens with the data. And you see here from quite a recent case in September, there was quite a high profile privacy breach by a company in Norway who were using an online translation tool during litigation. They used an online tool to translate these documents, and these documents were quite sensitive in nature in many of the cases, emails, staff, personal details, social security, things like that. And what happened was a couple of weeks after this tool was used, there was an academic in a university in Norway who was searching online, and a lot of this private information started to appear in search results. This will terrify people in the legal profession that this is something that can happen, and it's what scares people away from translation tools. But I think suffice to say that this applies to these types of tools, but when we're talking about professional machine translation solutions, they're typically run on private clouds or private servers that can rigorously control where the data actually goes. So data processing can be geo-fenced to remain in a particular jurisdiction or to not go to certain blacklisted jurisdictions. And then while the data is on these services, it's typically protected by state-of-the-art security protocols. Just to give you an idea from our own particular case, when we're talking about a cloud service, we use Amazon Web Services, and the yellow or the orange circles, as you see them there, are the various data centers that Amazon has around the world. And we have the ability, like I said, to restrict which of those the data actually goes to. So there's quite a lot of flexibility around the world with that. And again, from a data retention policy, typically with machine translation, and particularly in our case, our retention policy is not to retain data. We don't need to retain the data. So if we're working in a review platform, when something gets sent to us for translation, it's only on these servers for as long as it's being processed. And once the translations are complete, they're no longer kept on the servers. And so that's typically the retention policy in professional machine translation services, because the business model is completely different from free online tools who might be more interested in data collection. If for whatever reason, typically dictated by the particular case at hand, that cloud solutions are not suitable, we always have the option, in the worst case, to bring the software in-house and install it on servers. But that's just one aspect of it. So I talked earlier on about flexibility and integration, and there's a lot that needs to be done with translation software to make it more practical for a particular use case. So it's all well and good having software that carries out translation, but from an e-discovery perspective, we've had to work on a lot of things over the last 12 months to make the software fit in more better into this particular industry. The first thing we had to do was cover lots of different file formats. So I guess that covers checking off the main things like various different flavors of Microsoft Office documents, particularly covering PDFs with the ability to do OCR. Emails are, I think, the most common content type that we come up against. So being able to handle different flavors of that, like EML and MSG messages, depending on what clients they're coming from, email clients that is. And then looking a little bit further down the road as to what might be coming, or what's increasingly coming, is audio content, whereby before we can actually do the translation or even do sort of any technology assisted review, we have to go from speech and transcribe this into machine readable format. The second thing is language identification. So I mentioned earlier on that aside from the machine translation, that we also work in more general language technology, and language identification is one idea of this. So I guess this has a couple of different strands. Is, you don't necessarily know what different languages are present in your data set, and so to have a capability within the machine translation to be able to take that task off your plate and pre-detect what language those documents are in. And again, from our particular perspective, coming in our next release very soon, is the ability to detect multilingual documents, so documents that contain more than one language. And this is funny because in any other vertical or use case of machine translation, you're typically dealing with one language per document. And we'd never seen examples like this outside of e-discovery until we started working with email threads, where we've seen up to 6 or 7 different languages. So the idea here is that we take in a single document and identify all of the different languages that are present in there, send them all off to the respective machine translation systems, and combine the say English translations back into a single document at the end of the day. And this is a particularly valuable feature. The last point here is then workflow integration. As I'll mention towards the end, translation is not the main goal here. It's a means to an end. So we need to make sure that it fits into the workflow as seamlessly as possible. And there are basically 2 ways to do this. Starting from the bottom up here, we can have an API that allows our users to develop their own integrations to whatever software they're using, put it into their workflow. And then secondly is to have existing connectors into existing review platforms. And clearly the most popular platform for carrying out document review is Relativity. And so only last month, in October, we went to Relativity Fest in Chicago and launched our integration with Relativity to allow you to access the translations directly from that workflow. And what I want to do now is take just a couple of minutes to actually show you how this works in practice. So here we are in Relativity. For those of you not familiar with it, like I said, it's the most popular document review platform where documents are ingested and sorted before the review process is actually carried out. So what I'm going to do is navigate into one of the workspaces here, where you see up in the top right here, our iconic translation integration is installed. And on the left here in kind of a file explorer view, we're going to see the different documents that we have laid out. And then there are essentially two ways in which we'll be able to carry out translation: on an individual document level, or as a mass action, or essentially translating multiple documents at the same time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to navigate into some German documents here and go down to ones that aren't completed. So let's navigate into this particular document here. And what happens essentially, like I said, making it integrated into the workflow. Here we are viewing our document. And once this is loaded, we'll see now here that we have an iconic translate button. So this is a German email. We want to be able to review it in English, run analytics on it. We click translate. We allow the system to automatically detect that this document is in German. It's got 4 pages. We want to translate this into English. We submit that request, and now this has gone off to the translation service. If we navigate back to the document list, this document will either be now in progress or the translation will have completed. We'll see that again in our document list view. We scroll down. So now we see that this document the translation is in progress. So I'm just going to go into another document to show you that's already completed, to show you what this actually looks like once it's done. So again, here we have a brief German email. Once the translation is done, we'll see that there's a translation family because the status is completed. So if we expand the translation family pane down here, we'll see that there's an English document now attached to the original. And once we view that, we'll be able to see the English translation of that email in here. And again, also what we do is we translate on the basis of the native file. So if there was any formatting on the original document, that would all be retained as well. And if I just navigate back out to the document view to show you the mass action option with the translation function, if we want to translate large volumes of documents, which again is probably the most common use case that document reviewers will be coming up against, we can select an entire batch of documents here, and in the mass action function you'll see the iconic translation button, and that will essentially grab all those documents, 25 docs, 43 pages, and you'll be able to translate them all in one go. So that's just a quick digression to show you an example of how this technology can be integrated into a particular workflow. To move on, this is just an example of the range of languages that we can support. So I think there are 52 different languages here. And again, this is quite important to be able to cover all of the bases and have that availability there when these cases come up. And one other point I wanted to touch on, because it's a question that comes up quite frequently, is around cost models and business models around translation software. And so, at least from our particular perspective, we have broadly 3 types of cost models. One is for the cloud service, where costs are incurred on essentially a pay-as-you-go basis. It's a consumption model based on the amount of data translated, be that in words or pages or gigabytes. And then a subscription in this case would typically cover all languages. So it's pay-as-you-go for any particular language. There's no kind of difference depending on the language. On-premise models are slightly different. It's more of a standard software license based on the number of languages that are required to be supported. But then once something is on premise, usage is unlimited. So there's no kind of restrictions around consumption on that basis. But then also, as is quite common in the legal industry, there are professional services options on top of that. So the first one is translations being run and as a managed service. So for example, if you're not using a particular review platform, or there's not an integration there, or there's simply not the bandwidth on your side to actually have the translations processed, this is something that can be done as a managed service by sharing the documents through some sort of secure channel and having them processed and returned. And then there are also customization and development services. So if there was some kind of bespoke need to integrate the translation into a particular platform, or actually customizing the translation software itself for a particular use case. So actually, as a company, this is one of our kind of the core things that we do, is adapting the technology for specific languages and use cases. And if that is required for whatever particular reason, that's something that can be done as well. So what I want to do now to wrap up is just go through some case studies to show you how this technology is used within e-discovery, document review, but also some wider use cases as well. So this is a particular case that we were involved in, where there was a law firm that had quite a large case with a large number of foreign language documents, and they were using an e-discovery provider in order to carry out the review. And the firm worked with ourselves as a technology provider, and led by Park IP, one of our partners, who carry out the professional human translation. And so the idea here is that there was a review team mainly comprised with English document reviewers, but with a small number of reviewers for the foreign language also. And so in the first instance, this technology was deployed on site with the firm due to the requirements of the case. And so what happens here then essentially is the 60,000 documents come through, and they all get machine translated in the first instance, and then are reviewed by the large English-speaking review team, who then identify those hot documents, or those documents that are potentially quite relevant. And what happens then is those documents, the native file in the original foreign language, are reviewed by the foreign language team to kind of drill that a little bit deeper and make sure that nothing was lost in translation. And then if there are a certain set of those documents that are required to be presented in court or to the opposition or whatever the case may be, those key documents can then be human translated to have a certified translation there. And I think this is a fantastic use case of how various approaches can actually work in tandem to produce the most efficient and effective workflow, where we have a mix of contracted reviewers, internal reviewers, machine translation, and human translation, all kind of at our fingertips in one go. But if I just want to kind of highlight some other ways in which machine translation is used, it's actually probably a lot more pervasive than you think. You know, as I guess predominantly native English speakers in the audience here, we're not exposed to it as much. But people speaking foreign languages, especially languages in, I guess, countries that have smaller economies, they would be probably consuming a lot more machine translation. So one area where this is quite common, and an area that we're very actively involved in, is intellectual property. And the use case here is not tremendously different than document review, except we have much more structured documents. So let's say you want to file a patent in China, you need to make sure that your patent is not going to infringe on any Chinese patent that already exists. So essentially to establish that you have freedom to operate in China. What you will do is you'll do a search in the Chinese Patent Office's database, but all of those documents are going to be in Chinese. And so you need, a good enough translation to be able to review those Chinese documents and determine whether any of them are relevant to your patent or not. Another very, very popular case, completely nothing to do with legal here, is for multilingual customer support. So that could be either online chat, where instead of having to have multiple customer support representatives in different countries speaking different languages, this can all be done via machine translation, where let's say you have English-speaking customer support, a request comes in from a Spanish-speaking client that gets machine translated into English. The response then is written in English, which gets machine translated to Spanish for the client. And the same can be said for online help content, which is often authored in English, but then machine translated into the various languages of the different markets. And this can again reduce the the overhead costs of multilingual customer support. And another area where we're seeing a really growing demand for machine translation is in regulatory compliance. So as I've said already, we have big companies, particularly financial institutions, operating globally, and they need to ensure that their staff are compliant with various regulations. So these staff members are communicating in various different languages, and you have the controllers who need to be able to monitor this activity and make sure that there's nothing nefarious going on. And if that is multiple different languages, then again, translation, particularly machine translation, is particularly crucial here. So just to wrap up here, I kind of touched on this already. I guess we as translation/translation technology providers are very aware that if we look at the EDRM here, that translation is not the goal here. When translation is required, a detour is needed off this regular process. So the whole goal is to make the solutions as effective as possible so that this detour is as seamless as possible. Because I've mentioned the variables here are many. We don't know what languages are going to be involved, so we need to be able to cover as many as possible. We don't know what file types are going to be involved, so again, they need to be supported. Various review platforms could be used, some of which will try to support upfront, some of which will provide the capability to support, and then the various other requirements of a case, whether that's the ability to use the cloud, requiring an on-premise solution. It's incumbent upon us as providers to be able to cover these bases. But what we're certainly seeing in conclusion is that machine translation is in the tech stack of many law firms and e-discovery service providers, and we don't think it's going away given the trends that we've seen. But that's not bad, because it's often the only practical option when we're dealing with massive volumes of content and short turnaround times. But again, it's often the best option, and best is determined by multiple different factors that we've already shown. Again, this is all okay because this demand is only going to grow. We've seen what's going to happen with that increase in electronically stored information, and the fact that that is going to be multilingual to a large extent. But the good thing that you can breathe a sigh of relief here is that this type of technology is only going to get better. I touched on it very briefly earlier on, but we have just gone through a paradigm shift in this type of technology. So previously, for the last 25 years, the state of the art was what we call statistical machine translation. And now we have this tool or this approach called neural machine translation, which is the way people are going to do machine translation in the future. At the moment, we're kind of running things in parallel with various hybrid solutions. But what neural machine translation has done in the short term is that it's opened the doors for tasks that have been really hard for machine translation in the past. So, for example, when we're looking at easier languages like, say, French and Portuguese, there wasn't a lot of room for improvement there. There was some room for improvement, but not a massive amount. So the impact hasn't been as big there. But on the other end of that scale, looking at languages, particularly like Japanese and Korean, we've seen a real uptick in performance with machine translation, given the advent of neural machine translation. And this trend is only going to continue, which is really positive. So that's all for me from now. I'm going to wrap up. Like I said, we're going to make this webinar recording available to all attendees of the webinar early next week, and we'll put the slides online. And if there are any questions after that, please don't hesitate to contact us. You see some of the contact details on the slide there. And in the meantime, thank you very much for attending, and have a nice rest of your day.